consider as a fellowship was the question, is it possible to have a nonviolent America? This morning we consider this question with humility on this Sunday when we remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all those prophetic voices of many ages who have challenged the human family to grow into its potential, to embody peace, justice, compassion, and love. Ours is a profound question, perhaps one of the most important for our day, when violence on a global scale has the capacity to wipe out all life on our planet. And our violence against the earth itself has the potential ultimately for the same end. So thank you to whoever offered this topic. My early thoughts from way back last May led me to consider war and peace on a global scale. For many of us, it's easy to say we oppose war and support peace. But over the months, there's lots that's happened in our society. So from the focus of war and peace, I began to ask myself the question, is a nonviolent America possible? My knee-jerk reaction is no. Look at our history. From the landing of Western Europeans on this shore, we have solved our problems through violence very often, perpetrated on others, whether it was upon native peoples or the enslavement of people of color or a war carrying a big stick around the world. As a nation, if we're truthful, we have sinned greatly. That is one view of our history, one we cannot forget because we need to be reminded that the shadow of domination and power lurks within human society. On the other hand, the people of this nation are a generous people who seek to do good. There are people who every day throughout our history, throughout our society, have risked their lives, have given their lives so that others might live and live meaningful lives. How many of us sitting here were Peace Corps volunteers, have served in the military, have worked and are working for social service agencies in education, medical professions, as nurturing parents, and in other forms of caring service to others? We do those things because we want to create a better society and world. So to address the root of our question, I ask us where violence emerges in our society. And when I ask that question myself, coming from a place of care and compassion, my answer to the question of, is a nonviolent America possible, then I answer yes. It's not an easy yes. It's not a comfortable yes. Because if nonviolence is possible, then members of our society, each one of us, must take personal and corporate responsibility for creating nonviolence in our midst. That's a big task. Moving toward a nonviolent America will mean that people of faith, people of compassion, people of commitment will have to build nonviolence on multiple levels to change the direction our society is moving. Consider a bit of the history about our fellowship that we shared last week. Consider how this community has changed over 60 years. Consider what some of you have done in your lifetimes to help in small but significant ways to change this community, to grow this fellowship, to make a difference. Multiply that across the country. We don't hear about those small things much, but it gives me hope to consider that. And also consider how much damage can be done very quickly when caring people become complacent. The reality is, if we give up, things will never change. We will continue to have a society that is increasingly violent. That frightens me for our children, for our grandchildren, for everyone's children and grandchildren. To create a truly nonviolent America, the reality is that we must begin with ourselves and how we unwittingly can foster the seeds of violence in our own lives. For change in our society to happen, it must first emerge within individuals, and only then can it ripple out into society. In truth, nonviolence begins with our own thoughts. We too easily point to others to say, that is violent, they're on the wrong side. Yet in doing that, are we holding anger towards others? Is our own negativity promoting violence and polarization? I remember during the presidency of the last Bush, I had a UU friend who was so angry that his total focus was on his anger toward the president. This kind and gentle man gave his thinking and time over to his anger. He was focused on hostility without any sense of what he could and maybe should do in a positive way to create a better society. His anger began to taint his reactions and his relationships with others. So I ask, are we living in compassionate ways toward all those we meet, even those we consider to be different? Can we, in the living of our lives, assume positive intent on the part of others? Do we respond with kindness rather than judgment? Sometimes people make mistakes. Do we harbor then anger, or do we learn to offer forgiveness when people inadvertently hurt us? I know this seems like a different issue than is nonviolence in America possible, but it's all interconnected. For many of us UUs, our own nonviolence might include healing from our religious past or making peace with family and friends. Our own thoughts and actions lay the foundation for a nonviolent America. The next layer necessary to create a nonviolent America is to promote nonviolence in our local communities. Where do we find in this area violence being perpetuated? Is violence introduced in the home and family through interactions such as domestic violence? What about our schools? We're always hearing about children being bullied at school. How do children learn patterns of violence in these two foundational institutions in American society, family and school? And then what are people of goodwill doing to mentor children so that they then relearn patterns of relating, so that they learn nonviolent ways of relating. What has happened to us when we no longer stop in shock when children kill children in our schools and neighborhoods, or when we dismiss violence when it happens in poor communities? Are we so accustomed to violence that we no longer are horrified by what our society is becoming? You know, I hear us talking all the time about children becoming desensitized to violence through video games. But what of us adults who are desensitized to violence from our news reporters? We need to heal families and schools and support struggling families. From families and schools, the work for nonviolence must spread outward. What are the institutions in our society that perpetuate violence against those least able to care for themselves? That's why we went to Columbia this week. Violence comes in the form of lack of health care, inadequate education, lack of housing and food, or work that pays a living wage. These are the areas of institutionalized violence that leave people feeling hopeless. It's easier to talk about war in the world than it is to talk about our own institutionalized violence. Mothers and fathers work 2 or 3 jobs and are still not able to feed, house, and clothe their families. That is violence against the most vulnerable members of our society. We know this. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. It's the most pervasive violence that we see, and it's the most dangerous violence for the future of our society. So let's take a breath. Lest we get discouraged completely, let's look at how many young people are responding to what seems to be a completely discouraging future. Let's take a look at some of the literature that our young people are reading. It is very often a commentary on our society and the challenges for this next generation. So let's look at the literature being put into film. The Hunger Games. How many of you have seen the movie? Okay. The Hunger Games contains violence. It was not particularly pleasant to watch. And it contains violence because it addresses the violence in our society and the suffering of people when a country's resources are held by only a few. Our young people are listening to the lesson that human society forgets. Violence is born out of oppression of mind, body, and spirit, and the message that we need people of courage to show the way and chart the course. They are learning the lesson that people who do not lose heart can bring profound change within society. They're asking us, how do we break the cycle of violence? An answer might be to build communities of respect in which the pluralism in our society becomes essential to the foundation that will be rooted in nonviolence. Pluralism assumes that everyone's voice will be heard, that basic needs will be met. The future depends on our dedication to rebuilding the devastations of generations, as the prophet Isaiah said. But let's stop here and acknowledge that often we're really overwhelmed by what needs to be repaired, so that we don't know where to begin to bring respect and tolerance and compassion compassion back into our society. I admit it's easy to get discouraged because there is so much to do. And we need to rebuild on many levels. We need to work on the systemic level to change laws that are exclusionary, and we need to help sustain people with their most basic needs, both ends of the spectrum. But we can't do everything. We know that. We can't take it all on. How do we decide what we can do? That's an important question for us to answer that I trust we're going to work on this year. It's easy also to discuss intellectually the importance of teaching people to fish rather than giving them fish, but let's face it, as caring people, can we allow children, families, and individuals in our community to remain hungry and homeless in our midst? They can't wait for the laws to be changed. Many of them will die before the systemic work is done. So here we are, people who really care. The important question for us to answer is what is ours to do as we help create an America where nonviolence becomes institutionalized. We can't do everything lest we go under from exhaustion. And it's easy to listen to the sirens of our society. I want to go back to the opening words by Dr. King. You know, sirens are not always lovely, luring travelers into dangerous waters. They're also dangerous, for sometimes they spread negativity and encourage compassion overload. These sirens eke out our energy, disabling and discouraging us as we work for change. There are the sirens of media, which only give out negative news, leaving out all the good that people across this country are doing. Too often, spreading misinformation that helps polarize people who might otherwise work together. These are the dangerous sirens. No, we must find our own Orpheus. We must find the song for our journey, which reminds us that beauty and goodness survive. Our siren song must be one of commitment, of vision, of compassion, and of hope that will lead us through the treacherous waters of our day. Our song must remind us that we are not in this for the short run, but for the long haul, and that we are going to need to sustain one another. Once again, our young adult literature offers a message for envisioning the future. In the book Ender's Game, there's a quote: "There are times when the world is rearranging itself, and at times like that, the right words can change the world." What are the words that we have to offer in this time so that change can happen? As we move deeper into our 60th year, we're looking at our history. This congregation, as we talked about last week, supported change in the face of institutionalized violence in those early years. Part of the early work that was ours to do was to support each other when members began the Clemson Child Development Center, and when we lived our lives daily through our work. We looked beyond the cultural divisions and stereotypes and found the face of our sisters and brothers and children in need. In Ender's Game, the main character says, "I think it's impossible to really understand somebody, what they want, what they believe, and not love them the way they love themselves." Because we are caring people, we look at the state of our local community and our nation, and at times shake our heads and go home and turn on the television maybe. But let us join together so that we can focus not on everything, but on what we can change. Look at the interfaith work that is being done with Family Promise, the interfaith environmental and social change work. Much has changed. We sometimes forget that. Much has changed, not always for the good, but much good is getting done. Let us remember that. After all, where would the world be if we give up, if we lose hope? We must focus on the reality of what Margaret Mead wrote years ago. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Is it possible to have a nonviolent America? With hope and commitment, I say yes, it is possible. It is possible if concerned, ethical people remain committed. Is it possible if those people become complacent or silent? No. Our task this year is for us to decide what is our work to do as we move into the future. And how can we nurture and sustain one another so that we can go out into the world to live each day with hope, with peace in mind and heart, offering hope to those we meet. How will we create nonviolence in our small part of America? How will we rebuild our land? I invite us to rise in body and spirit for our closing hymn.